Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the fifth lecture of the Reading the Past series organized by the Office of Communication under the Paraspar theme. Today, we are very happy to have Professor Janaki Nair, who will speak on the monarchical modern in the making of Mysore city. Welcome, Professor Nair. To give a brief introduction of the speaker today, Professor Janaki Nair is a historian and author. She has taught at the Center for Historical Studies in Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. And before that, she has taught at the Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta, and at the Institute for Social and Economic Change, Bangalore. Her field of interests are in social, political, and cultural history of Mysore and Karnataka, legal history, urban history, feminism, and visual culture. Professor Nair has published widely. Her authored books include Mysore Modern, Reconceptualizing the Region Under Princely Rule, published by University of Minnesota Press in 2011, and Orient Black Swan in 2012. The Promise of Metropolis, Bangalore's 20th Century, published by the Oxford University Press, published in 2005. And the second printing was done in November 2005 in the same year. Miners and Milhan's work, Culture and Politics in Princely Mysore, published by SAYS Publication in 1998. Women and Law in Colonial India, a social history published by Kali for Women in 1996. Her edited books include with Anjan Ghosh and Tapti Guha Thakurta, Theorizing the Present, Essays for Partha Chatterjee, published in 2011. With Marijon, A Question of Silence, Sexual Economies of India, published in 1998. Professor Nair has been awarded the New India Foundation Book Prize for her Promise of the Metropolis, Bangalore's 12th Century in 2005. We are very happy to have you, Professor Nair. May I now invite you to deliver your lecture?
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to this series. And let me start by saying that this is an article which is shortly to appear in a journal called Urban History. There is a special issue on royal cities that is coming out of this journal. So what I'm going to present to you today is something that is shortly going to be published. And without further ado, let me just start this paper. I'm, as I said, as Vitasa has just said, I have been interested in urban history, and this is something that I have continued in looking at the city of Mysore. I take it, Vitasa, that I have about 45 minutes to an hour?
Yes, correct.
Okay, and at some point I will start sharing the PowerPoint, but
sure.
Should I do it right away?
Whatever is okay with you.
Okay, so let me it's a long paper and I'm going to read the whole thing, and I thought I would just summarize parts of it. But I am basically here engaging with a particular way in which histories of the city in South Asia have been understood. They have been investigated as much from the lens of monumental architecture as for especially the new kinds of techniques of sanitation, water supply, roads, parks, public transport, lighting, and indeed planning that were introduced, however fitfully and unevenly, as municipal administrations, increasingly under indigenous leaders, were formed from the late 19th century. Now, Mysore city, as the royal capital of the princely state of Mysore, offers us the chance of bringing together these two kinds of materialities in order to elaborate what I am choosing to call a practice of power that I describe as the monarchical modern. As a city divested of administrative functions, and this is something I'm sure you all know, since there were new ones, and Mirza's triumph, as I have noted elsewhere, over the Gettesian principle in 1915, which he has detailed in his memoirs, gave him a freer hand to align with Krumbigal and with the Maharaja in elevating the aesthetic to its position of independent value. So I'm suggesting here that something other than Raj Dharma is happening or is emerging, which is the valorization of the aesthetic as having an independent value. And we see it most clearly in the evacuation of the fort and the isolation of the palace as a sculptural element which is to be set in ornamental gardens and in rolling lawns. Again, I'm not going to go the details of this, but I'm just going to say briefly about Krumbigel's career in Mysore. It was interesting precisely because he arrived with formidable skills as an economic botanist, but he turned into landscape gardener, town planner, and even architect. And he was prized for his aesthetic sensibilities and for unseating traditions of flower and plant growing that were well known and practiced for centuries. And for instance, he had a great deal of impatience for local plants and the untidiness of the local plants, which he said were not visually pleasing at all. And he begins this long process by which he is actually uprooting certain kinds of plants, such as, for example, the Acalypha indica, which is a kind of an Indian nettle, it's a herbal plant, and Arunda donax, which is the tall perennial cane. These are sort of being made to yield place to the more recognizably flowering plants with which you can decorate herbaceous, to decorate borders and flower beds and so on and so forth, and of course the rolling lawn. And as I have pointed out in my book, also the opening of the east gate of the fort to the palace was something that happens at this time and is very much designed with an eye on symmetry, which is supreme. I will just show you here the two maps of Mysore Fort Palace between the 1890s and 1902. As you can see in the map above, there is a certain kind of crowding with structures around the palace even at this time. A gradual decongestion that is happening until we come up with this, which is what we have in the present day, which, as you can see, is even the temples are positioned with an eye on symmetricality rather than following any principles of, I would say, of Rajdharma, although that's the argument that Aya Ikegame is making. These temples, and in fact, I know from the files of the building of the Gayatri Temple that it was definitely designed with an eye on symmetry. So there is this new aesthetic. This is, of course, the east gate, which is piercing this fort wall here, being laid out, allowing, as it were, unobstructed vision of the palace from the east end. That was the intention. So it didn't follow the principles of fort building here either. And it's interesting that the fort, which is basically a strategically unimportant structure in the mid-19th century, and in fact is being dismantled in the presidency towns, is in fact being rebuilt and instituted in the case of Mysore. Okay, so I think that I've made my point enough that Krumbigel takes over as economic botanist of Mysore, landscaped the Garden Park and the Curzon Park, whose status as ornamental or landscape was always a little bit indeterminate, but there was something about the fact that he left his imprint on these kinds of measures that were undertaken within the city, not without some contestations. Here again, we see that the municipality is suggesting to the trust board that there be a planting of trees on the main roads of the city. And then there is this trust board which is turning quite indignant, saying that the planting of avenue trees is desirable, is not desirable from a sanitary point of view, and that there was no room and money for indulging in this roadside arboriculture, as they called it. So, you know, our intention, they say, is to provide special attention to slums and other insanitary areas. Anything intended to beautify the city is not intended to fall within the scope of operations of the trust board. So there were wrangles between the trust board and the city and the municipality, and of course the powers that be between the palace and the bureaucracy, as to who would actually pay for the ornamentalization or for the botanization of Mysore city. But there was a touch which Mirza introduces, which explains the necessity of doing this in order to make Mysore a tourist destination. So already by the 1930s, he's talking about the economic imperatives of turning Mysore into a tourist destination, for which by 1930, you have 25 of Mysore's 108-mile, 80-mile roadage being turned into avenues with trees. And there was even a touch of Paris, which was added by the introduction of 2 broad avenues as boulevards. And as I said, it took Mirza Ismail to make this argument about the encashability of beauty. And he was quite persuasive. And the state's responsibility to beauty in this regard. So it was really him who it brings me to the next point I want to make about the ornamentalization, the gastronomy of the eye, as it were, which was no longer a luxury, but was an imperative. So when we turn to ornamentalization, it was not just the inoculation of the royal family from potential infection that was the goal of the decongestion of the fort and the laying of sewage lines, etc. But there was an interest in building up this new royal aesthetic. Ornamentalism in the city took many forms. For one, it involved the construction of palaces for 3 sisters of the Maharaja between 1905 and 1917. I'll quickly run through some of the palaces that begin to be built in Mysore. This is the Lokranjan Mahal or the Summer Palace. This is Jagamohan Palace. Both these belong to a slightly earlier period, but it's these, and then there is the Oriental Research Institute, the High Court, and these 3 buildings, the first Maharaj Kumari's mansion, which was built in 1904-1905, the second Maharaj Kumari's mansion, which was built by 1914, the Karanji Vilas, and then Cheluamba Vilas, which is the third Maharaj Kumari's mansion, completed in 1917, is adding this very sort of ornamental touch to the landscape of Mysore city. And it is accompanied by an interesting development of settling the Arzu clansmen as well on equally important site placed under the care of the Maramat department. And thirdly, there was an insistence by the time of Seshadri Iyer itself, as early as the time of Seshadri Iyer, not only to put on new good frontages for these newly constructed homes, often at municipal expense, but also plant broad streets with avenue trees. Now, none of these measures, as I say repeatedly here, were uncontested, whether by individuals who were querying the public purpose in acquisition of land for private aristocratic homes, or from the municipality itself objecting to expenditure on beautification. For instance, Diwan Seshadri Iyer's demand for good frontages to be built on Pleasure Palace Road at municipal cost was strenuously opposed because it was considered of doubtful benefit and not a legitimate charge in municipality funds, which had to be spent on the sanitation of the city. Still, as many as 13 owners were asked to be paid by the municipality to bring these frontages of their homes up to aesthetic scratch, as it were. And Mirza Ismail was continually faulted by journalists in his time as Diwan and also as private secretary to the Maharaja for having paid too much attention to the aesthetics of city building when there were hungry people around. And it was he who continuously makes this argument